Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. If you've not come across us before, we're a group of Christians. We believe that marriage is for a man and a woman because that's a picture of Jesus and the church for eternity. And we are same-sex attracted, or perhaps we're gay. That's our topic for today, as we deal with another question that nobody wants to answer. How should Christians who are attracted to the same sex talk about themselves? And to discuss that, I'm joined by my colleagues, Ed and Andrew. Great to have you with me. Let's get us started. We're talking about how we describe ourselves, so let's leave sexuality aside for the moment. Any other words you would use to describe yourself? Ed, go on. How would you describe yourself if you introduce yourself to somebody who didn't know you?
Well, I'd say, often it's what your job, isn't it? I'd say I'm a pastor. I'm a church pastor, and I'd pronounce it in a nice southern way that doesn't confuse any sort of my job with pastor. So I would say I'm a church pastor.
So for those who don't know, Ed has just had a jibe at me because I'm very definitely a pastor because there is only one R in pastor rather than two, and I'm from the north. But anyway, let's go to a fellow northerner who will speak properly. Anne, how would you describe yourself?
Well, funnily enough, I got asked a similar question in a job interview once, although they couched it in terms of how would other people describe you. And I thought, oh, great, this is a chance to sort of humbly show off a bit. So I said diligent, creative, and then I totally panicked and couldn't think of another adjective. So I just went, ginger.
I think it's your colleagues, diligent, ginger and creative. That sounds about right to me, yeah. Andrew, any great words to describe you?
Well, my instant thought also was, I wonder what other people think. And I thought for me, it would be things like analytical, pernickety, obsessive, hopefully also vaguely fun and a bit caring, but definitely pernickety, I feel, is right up there.
For those, obviously, you can't see this, there's just lots of sort of nodding heads going around, given that we work with Andrew and he edits our blogs and so on. So yeah, analytical, pernickety, yeah, that will do. I tend to go for introvert, actually, and normally my follow-up is by which I find my own company endlessly fascinating, which I think is the definition of an introvert. You just think, why water down the sort of joy of your own company with others? So...
Well, also, introducing yourself as an introvert to someone else is basically saying, please go away. I don't want to be with you.
That's about right, really. So, excellent. That's quite easy, working out how we describe ourselves as we talk about our personalities. But the one we're going to focus on is how do we talk about ourselves in terms of sexuality? That's our issue for today. Great. So it seems to me, as I listen to conversations, that there are probably two main ways that people are beginning to talk about themselves. One would be to say, I'm a celibate gay Christian. That's for those who are committed to the traditional Christian ethic. I'm a celibate gay Christian. Whereas others who would have the same theology would say, I'm a Christian who experiences same-sex attraction. Celibate gay Christian who experiences same-sex attraction. And there's a fair amount of controversy, perhaps particularly over in the States, around which of those you would use, with quite a lot of suspicion in the air as well. What I want to do now is just try and tease out amongst us the different reasons why people might come to a conclusion on this. So, Anne, do you want to kick us off? Why might people want to talk about being a celibate gay Christian?
I think, first of all, the word gay has some cultural currency. People kind of understand what that means. We talk about people who are gay and straight, and we kind of understand that means it's a description of who people are attracted to. We don't talk about people being other sex attracted. People don't use that as a description of themselves. And I think it's not necessarily a point about identity. Gay can just be a description of one's attractions. It doesn't necessarily say anything about behaviour. And actually modifying it with the word celibate helps people to understand that even though I experience attraction to other women, I've chosen not to act on that. So for me, using the word gay is just a really helpful, straightforward description of my attractions. I think it's also quite helpful because it makes it clear that the gospel is for gay people, that we don't shy away from that word, that gay people are welcome in church, that there are those of us who have come from a gay background and who experience gay feelings, who are Christians and who are enjoying the freedom in Christ that the gospel brings. I think as well, same-sex attraction it's a funny phrase, isn't it? It's sort of Christian jargon, really. I mean, nobody else seems to use that word, and often it even gets abbreviated to SSA because everybody loves an acronym. But it sort of sounds a bit like a disease, doesn't it? It can, it doesn't mean anything in the wider world. So often you find you're having to explain and unpack it anyway to people who aren't Christians. And it can be a term that's sort of treated with a bit of suspicion, I think. It's also got slightly unfortunate overtones for people who are familiar with the kind of gay conversion movement. And we've talked in our last episode, actually, about gay conversion therapy and some of the difficulties around that. And it's a term that has been associated with that in the past. So it may be that it's not a helpful term to use for some people. I think as well, I find using the term gay quite helpful when I'm talking to affirming Christians that's Christians who would be in support of gay marriage and blessing gay relationships. Because I think sometimes friends of mine who take that position try to sort of deny or minimise my story because I have a different position and because I don't affirm gay relationships. They sometimes try to sort of minimise my own gay feelings and gay experience. So actually using that terminology makes the point that not all LGBT people want to affirm same-sex relationships, that there are those of us who are gay and are choosing to live a celibate lifestyle because we believe that that marriage in the Bible is between a man and a woman.
Thanks, Anne. That's a really useful summary.
I just think that when you're trying to communicate today, you want to use the language that people will understand. And just as an exercise in good communication, if I'm talking particularly to younger people, I wanted to say, I'm gay. They know what that means. They're then really surprised that I'm a gay Christian, and that provides, as Anne was saying, an opportunity to talk about actually how you can be somebody who is gay, same-sex attracted, and a Christian, and that opens up possibilities for conversation. And I've just found, particularly when I'm working with younger audiences, talking to younger people, that it's the best word to use because it's good communication. People know what people know what you think. People know what you mean by the term, and then as you attach Christian to it, you get the chance to explain just so much about Jesus, really, and how he's accepting of all, if not affirming, of everything we as human beings do.
So, given that we've come up with some good reasons to talk about being perhaps a celibate gay Christian, what might be the dangers of it? Because there will be those who want to push back against that. Andrew, do you want to kick us off thinking about good reasons to talk actually instead about being, a Christian who experiences same-sex attraction?
Yeah, and there are some good reasons people helpfully raise. I just tend to think one benefit of the language of same-sex attraction is it's just a simple, plain description of an experience without too much else potentially mixed up in it. So the word gay can, for people, evoke other things. It can evoke an approval of same-sex relationships. It can even evoke a whole load of kind of cultural stereotypes at what gay people are like. Same-sex attraction is a bit more plain. It kind of does what it says in the tin, in a sense, just describing it in that way, which can be a helpful thing for various reasons. And actually, interestingly, I think that's beginning to be recognised more widely. And I think Anne's absolutely right that, broadly speaking, same-sex attraction hasn't been a term used broader than Christian circles or used very widely, but it's beginning to be used, actually. And it's interesting that organisations like the LGBT Alliance, a completely secular organisation, describe themselves as same-sex attracted and are very deliberately using that language. And there's various things going on in the kind of wider LGBT group community which are causing people to turn to this language because of the fact that it just in a very plain, simple way describes the core of the experience, which I think can be helpful. And maybe that's helpful when we think about that as Christians, because one of the benefits, therefore, is it kind of removes the risk of implying that our experience of sexuality is core to who we are as part of our identity. Some people would see the language of gay as too much being a statement about who I am at the core of my being, who I am as my identity, whereas same-sex attraction speaks of just part of my experience. And so it might be a helpful way of making that distinction that actually as Christians, who we are is children of God, and it might be that how we are is we are same-sex attracted, but that's not part of who we are, not part of our kind of core identity. So that nuance it brings can be a helpful thing. And I guess, as we said, the word gay can bring some can provoke some questions, ask some questions, but actually so can the term same-sex attracted because it's less commonly used. And there's also the opportunity, if one talks about oneself as same-sex attracted, people might think, oh, why is that? And that can become an opportunity to talk about our beliefs and maybe particularly talk about identity, actually. Who we are actually is about who God says we are, not anything we experience. So in a different way, it can also open conversation, raise some hopeful questions, which could be provocative in a good way, which we can make good use of.
Because I guess as we talk about sexuality at events and so on, one of the points we'll make quite frequently is this is part of our experience, but it's not the essence of who we are. So the essence of who we are is we're brothers of and sisters of the Lord Jesus. We're children of God who happen to be gay, same-sex attracted. And sometimes the phrase, I'm Christian who experiences same-sex attraction, is just a good way of illustrating that it's not my primary identity. It's just something that I experience.
Yeah, and I also think people's own personal story is a big determinative factor in sometimes the term they choose to use. So I've got friends who are same-sex attracted or gay, who were, before they became Christians, in same-sex sexual relationships. Gay was their identity. I think of somebody I know who said basically everybody he interacted with was gay. He had a gay dentist. He lived in the gay community. His lifestyle was a stereotypical gay lifestyle. And for him, it's been really helpful as part of his journey of discipleship in separating himself from that being the dominant identity in his life, and he's embracing the language of I experience same-sex attraction because it used to be he was all about being gay, and as he sought to become more like Jesus, wanted to sort of have an identity that's more rooted in Christ, less rooted in his sexuality. Therefore, he uses the language of I experience same-sex attraction. Whereas I've got other friends who grew up in cultures where nobody ever used the language gay. Gay were people out there who had nothing to do with Christianity. They never came across anybody like them who experienced same-sex attraction. And same-sex attraction was used, I think as Anne pointed out earlier, as a sort of almost a language of disease and a problem that needs to be solved by gay conversion therapy. And so they have, while not embracing same-sex relationships, they are wanting to describe themselves as gay Christians because suddenly this has been a bit of language that does describe an important part of who they are, if not their fundamental identity, in a way that's helped them make sense of who they are, in a way in which has helped them get support from other people. And the language of same-sex attraction has just was poisonous as they were growing up, and therefore they run a mile from using it as adults who are same-sex attracted, who are gay, but living the light of Bible teaching today. So often it's people's backstory that most explains which of the terms they're most keen, willing, unwilling to use.
So those are different reasons why people will come to varying conclusions on this. What would be different books or blogs that would put the varying positions? I was struck reading Greg Cole's book, Single Gay Christian, which uses that term very deliberately. And there's a lovely scene within it where he talks to his pastor about why he's using the phrase gay rather than same-sex attracted, largely along the lines that Anne suggested in terms of wanting to make clear that the gospel is for gay people. And I just found that a really compelling book. We've reviewed it on the Living Out website. So Single Gay Christian by Greg Coles would certainly be one example of putting that case. Anybody got an example of a book that would use the language of same-sex attraction?
Well, I think both both Sam Aubrey in Is God Anti-Gay would be much more cautious about using the language "I'm a gay Christian." I think it was being pointed out to me today that in my book, The Plausibility Problem, I'm quite reluctant to use the language. Wrote that back in sort of 6-7 years ago. It might have changed a little bit today. We'll come on to that. But those are sort of two books that take more of a cautious line on using the language of "I'm a gay Christian."
I think if you go broader than books as well, there's a really helpful blog series. Our friends over in the States, the Centre for Faith and Sexuality, there's a blog series, like a conversation between Greg Coles, who would comfortably use the language of gay Christian, and Rachel Gilson, who prefer to use the language of same-sex attraction. And they kind of have a dialogue through this blog series of why they take those positions, how they interact with each other's positions. Just a helpful way of thinking through it, and a good way of seeing how good dialogue, good disagreement can take place. So I'm sure we can put a link in the show notes for that, but that's on the blog of the Centre for Faith and Sexuality.
So those are the different cases that are around for using celibate gay Christian or Christian who experiences same-sex attraction. In the second part, we'll talk about where we've landed personally, and also try and give some advice for individuals and for the church as it seeks to move forward with this discussion.
Hello, Anne here with an exciting announcement. The Living Out team are going on tour. We've got 3 training days to explore sexuality in our culture, the biblical picture, and how we can support same-sex attracted Christians at church. So we're going to be in Cheltenham on Saturday the 29th of January, Leicester on Saturday the 5th of March, and Lancaster on Saturday the 19th of March. You can find out more details and book on our website, livingout.org. Also, just to let you know that our friends at True Freedom Trust are running a women's conference in London on the 26th of February, where Jeanette Howard will be speaking on the theme of My Beloved, My Friend. For more information and to book that event, go to truefreedomtrust.co.uk.
So in the first part, we talked about the debate to describe yourself as same-sex attracted or a celibate gay Christian. Let's talk more personally. Where have we landed on this discussion? What kind of terminology do we tend to use as we talk about ourselves? Ed, do you want to kick us off with that one, seeing as you've alluded to something as you mentioned your book in the first part?
Yeah, I think probably early on, having come out in the sort of slightly unusual way we all have, I tended to use just the language of I experience same-sex attraction, I'm same-sex attracted, and shied away from the gay language. That was partly because I was a little bit, I didn't particularly like the gay language and the stereotypes that come along with it. I also was reluctant to sort of say anything that might encourage somebody to suddenly try and matchmake me with their gay friend Brian. So those were the sort of reasons why I sort of said I experience same-sex attraction. I think I've just found increasingly in conversations with family and friends and other people who aren't Christians, it's just much easier in communication to use the language of gay. Although I was in a conversation just earlier today when I was talking to a journalist and I found myself saying I'm gay or same-sex attracted. I tend to use both, partly to, because I know that they connect with different people. Obviously, doing that repeatedly in a conversation becomes a bit of a tongue twister. So I tend to settle down to gay, particularly if I'm speaking in a secular context, because it just helps communication.
My views probably changed a bit over time. I think when I was first talking about my sexuality, late teens, early 20s, I was probably using both, but I began to realise that using the language of gay was, for me at that point, unhelpful. I think it actually did cause me to think my experience of sexuality was too core to who I am. And yeah, that a whole load of other baggage should come with it. So kind of began to use same-sex attracted more. I think then just reading more, thinking more, began to realise the arguments on both sides of the difficulties of both terms. I think now being a bit older in the last few years, I found actually I don't find that using the language of gay affects me in the same way. Probably because I'm more mature, more settled in who I am as a child of God and all that kind of stuff. But really where I've reached is in a sense, don't like the whole debate. I think we should have this podcast because it's a debate that happens, but I think the whole debate tends to be done really badly often and just tends to distract from actually important things of actually caring for gay same-sex attracted people, actually showing the love of Jesus, helping people know Jesus loves them. And so actually, my position now is deliberately agnostic. I refuse publicly to take a stand either way. And I tend to introduce myself, like when I'm doing a talk, introduce myself at the start as gay or same-sex attracted, as in use both, and then just deliberately interchange between the two. And there are some contexts in life where I would deliberately use one or other because I know it's going to help someone understand me better, or it's going to not offend someone or something. But I really just feel the whole debate has been unhelpful and is not the most important thing by far for us to talk about this topic. So I take a stand at being deliberately agnostic on it, really, and don't particularly care what language I use for myself or people use for me.
Yeah, I think I've had a similar experience to you, Andrew, in that it's been different at different stages in my life. I mean, so growing up as a non-Christian, I very strongly associated myself with the word gay, and it was a core part of my identity. It was the most significant thing about me, and it really affected, I guess, how I grew up and who I became to a certain extent. And then I became a Christian at 19, and my core identity changed and became rooted in Christ. And I did make that deliberate decision not to describe myself as gay or describe myself according to any other things that had been really important, because suddenly the most important thing to me was that I'm a child of God, that I'm a Jesus follower. And so that became my big identity. And then I guess over the years, there's been a bit of wrestling with it. And more recently, I've become much more comfortable again with describing myself as gay. Again, I probably do interchange between that and same-sex attracted, but I kind of realised at some point I was almost denying a lot of my story. And I've had to work out how to integrate all the experiences I've had in my life and in growing up with the fact that I am a Christian and that I'm choosing to be celibate and follow Christ. So I actually wrote a blog post on the Living Out blog called It's Not My Identity, but It Is My Story, trying to reconcile those two things, that being gay isn't the most important thing about me. It's not my core identity, but it has hugely shaped the person that I am. And even in a good way, God has used my experience of same-sex attraction to deepen my faith and draw me closer to him. So it's quite a nuanced position, and it's not as black and white as just rejecting out of hand loads of the experiences that I've had in my life. And I think the other really significant thing for me is the context of mission and talking to people who have a different view on sexuality to me, because I found it quite difficult sometimes that affirming friends have almost sort of rejected my same-sex attraction because I land on the side of I don't affirm gay relationships. I've got people who have wanted to sort of try and deny my whole experience of being gay, and it's quite hurtful to have a lot of my story erased. And so sometimes I would use the word gay there to make the point that it's been a huge part of my life and probably will continue to be, because I still experience same-sex attraction, even though I'm not choosing to act on it. I use both terms, but I find them both helpful in different ways, I think.
Slightly frustratingly, for the sort of excitement of the podcast, we were actually all having very similar journeys here. This isn't a kind of BBC debate with two of us at each other's throats. My journey would be broadly similar. I think it just depends what point I'm trying to make. So if I'm primarily wanting to make the identity point, my chief identity is Christian, capital C, I will probably use the Christian who's experiencing same-sex attraction. If I'm wanting to make a point about the universality of the gospel, that it is for all people, I may want to use the gay language. And it largely depends on which point both of those are true. Our identity is chiefly we're united with Jesus, and the gospel is for all people irrespective of their sexualities. And you're wanting to use different language at different points to make both of those massive points.
And I think sometimes, everybody uses language to describe their identity in different ways. You might use the term mother simply as a straightforward description of somebody who has children, but you might describe yourself as a mother, and by doing so, you're investing it with a huge amount of significance and meaning, and you're conveying the fact that being a mother is integral to your identity, and that's where you derive your value and your worth. So potentially any identity could become idolatrous. It could become something something that distracts you from your core identity as a child of God.
And I think it's just really important to make that point. Because we all do it all the time. So right at the beginning, I was asked how I'd describe myself. What word did I choose? Well, I'm a pastor, which, betrays the fact that a lot of my identity is caught up in my job as the pastor of a church. And some of that's good because it's who God has created to me. It's the role he's given me. But some of that's bad because it's become too important to me in many ways. And too often it is who I am in an unhelpful way. And it's crowded out. It's pushed away my identity as a child of God. And I think we've just got to recognise that sometimes there's some really ironic sort of contributions to this big debate where people are criticising people like us for describing ourselves as gay Christians while themselves over-investing, idolising in identity markers that might be used to describe their sexuality or might be about their marital status or their job. And we're being given a hard time for doing something that they themselves are doing. We've all got to question ourselves all the time and ask, what is my primary identity? Am I rooting my identity in the identity that God has given me as a child of God? Or am I trying to create my own identity, as human beings so often do, in being a dad, a husband, a wife, a child, a pastor, a mechanic, an engineer, whatever else it is? It's child of God that is our primary, all-embracing identity.
Which is a key discipleship point for all of us, irrespective of our sexualities, actually. One of the things we're really conscious of as we put this podcast together is there may be those who are gay, same-sex attracted, perhaps 20 years younger than at least some of us, who are sort of launching out on talking to friends and family about this, and they're trying to work out what label do I use. Anybody got any advice for our sort of 18, 19-year-old wanting to live as a Christian disciple, beginning to talk to friends about this? Any advice for them as to how to choose the terminology that they use?
I think it's quite helpful to describe experiences and feelings rather than to be too quick to label yourself with anything, whether it's sexuality or, as Ed was talking about, we could easily fall into the trap of making all sorts of other things integral to who we are. I think I'd want to encourage a teenager to be able to be open and honest about how they're feeling and do that in an environment with somebody that they trust, a safe place. But I think it can be, especially on things like social media and stuff, we can sometimes be sort of pushed into labelling ourselves too quickly with something that may or may not be true and may or may not be significant. So I would just suggest maybe sort of talking privately with somebody that you trust and working things through, and just, not being too quick to sort of stamp yourself with something that you might regret in the future.
Yeah, one of the things I think I was told as a teenager was that, things change when you are a teenager, and not to sort of label myself too quickly. It wasn't because I said to somebody, I think I might be gay. It was just a conversation I just overheard and found really helpful. And actually, I think one of the things about society today is that when I was growing up as a teenager in the 1990s, there were basically you could either be gay or straight. Those were the only choices you were allowed. Nowadays, there are loads more options. And at one level, that could be really confusing. But another level, that can be quite helpful because you're allowed to say nowadays as a teenager that you're unsure. Or there's language that just allows you to sort of communicate the fact that you don't feel you're quite, as it were, normally heterosexual, but you're not quite sure where you're landing. Queer language is sometimes used in those sort of terms. And I would, and people just recognizing there's a fluidity in sexuality amongst many people, if not everybody. So as a teenager today, you've got a wider range of labels to use. That can be confusing. It can also be a positive thing. I think society is saying to you now in a helpful way, you don't need to make a decision age 14 as to how you are going to define your sexual attraction for the whole of your life. And I think that's a really positive thing.
I agree. Ed wrote a good blog actually on that called Take Your Time a few months back, which is worth reading on that. And on just what would we say to a person in their late teens, think about this, I would also say to them, be prepared for that people are going to have an opinion on the language you use. Of all things, this is the thing I think people pick me up on, want to ask about, and either want to ask or have an opinion on. And I would just want to say to a teenager or a young person wrestling this, just be prepared for that. And actually, my gentle encouragement would be try not to be drawn into the debate, because I think that's not what you need at the time. And just try and be polite and gentle and kind, but actually keep it to the main focus. And even say, actually, you're more interested in work out what it means to love Jesus faithfully than you are a few bits of language at the moment. And just to, like a heads up, basically, people might well bring it up, but try not to be dragged in, because it can just get unhelpful.
So given that, what would we want to say to the church? We're aware of particular denominations over in America that have got very heated about this more recently. What would we want to be saying to churches around this discussion?
Well, that it's crazy to make the language around how you describe yourself the definition of orthodoxy. As if somebody that describes themselves as a same-sex attracted Christian is saved, and somebody that describes themselves as a gay Christian can't be saved. I mean, it would just seem to be unbiblical to make that sort of distinction. We know how we become Christians, which is trusting and depending on Jesus, following Jesus, putting our lives in His hands, and it's the sort of the joy and the behaviour and the trust that follows for that are the markers of a Christian, not whether or not they describe themselves as same-sex attracted or gay. And I found it deeply upsetting to see friends of mine, as it were, pushed out of orthodoxy because they just happen to use, or people's perceptions of orthodoxy, because they happen to use a particular way of describing their sexuality. That was seen to be, just going back a massive step in giving the impression to particularly the watching world that Jesus isn't for all, and that Jesus doesn't want to accept anybody, whatever they've done, and accept them into His family and offer them the forgiveness that comes through His death on the cross.
Linked to that, my kind of encouragement to anyone who has a strong view either side, or in a church that does, would be to listen to the stories and the reasoning of people. We've talked today about how this isn't easy to answer, because there are good and bad on both sides. And the peculiar thing, as Ed's mentioned, is sometimes actually the statement is made, if you use this language, you are saying this thing is core to your identity, when actually you talk to the people using that language, and they're absolutely not. They're really clear they're a child of God. This is part of their experience. There's some reasons they choose this language that's quite helpful or whatever. And it's just very unfair that people are making assumptions about why language is used and what it means for an individual without even giving people a hearing. And so I think just actually to have, as we've been trying to have dialogue, listen, understand each other. And that thing where it's okay to disagree, it's helpful to understand. It helps us sit well with disagreement when we understand why it's there. And listening to stories and reasoning helps us to do that.
And that's actually good advice for anything to do with sexuality. Listen to people's stories. If you want to do good care for people, good pastoral support, listen. And particularly on this discussion, we need to be good at listening to the reasons people have come to the conclusions that they have. And my suspicion is that as people make their choices, it is around those twin things. Our identity is in Christ, and we want to make clear that the gospel is for all. And we will use different language to explain that, but that's our core message. Thank you so much for listening. It's been great to have you with us in this second question that nobody wants to answer. Do feel free to like us and share with your friends, and join us again in 2 weeks' time when we'll pick up another issue that nobody else wants to answer, but we'll try to do so. Thanks for listening.